Manpreet, Sethi, James Acton, Bruno, Tertrais, welcome to the Global Technology Summit 2021. Before we get going on this particular panel, because of the time differences, we had to do a pre-record with Rory Medcalf. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Rory, in a sense, to speak, hoping very much that in the panel discussion, we could pick up some of your reactions. Rory Medcalf, it's great to have you at the Global Technology Summit 2021. My first question is on and around collective security. There are those who argue that AUKUS strengthens collective security and delivers a truly free and open Indo-Pacific. But then there are others, Russian officials, Chinese officials, but also a number of Europeans who argue that all AUKUS does is over-militarizes the Indo-Pacific, exponentially increases the opportunity of an arms race. Given these paradigms, Rory, could you give us a sense of how you read AUKUS?
So AUKUS is the new kid on the block when it comes to acronyms for security partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. And we all know what we think it means, the Australia, United States, UK Defence Technology Partnership, essentially, with a focus initially on nuclear-powered submarines for Australia. But I think we do have to be very careful about not exaggerating expectations of this one way or another. It's not going to, in my view, destroy the peace or destroy the non-proliferation regime. It is going to be helpful, I think, in the long run for Australia's security and regional security, but it's not on its own going to be some kind of silver bullet. So I think we need to look beneath the surface, literally look at the specifics and consider pretty objectively how they're going to affect the regional security environment. You know, the promise of Australia acquiring 8 nuclear-powered submarines sometime over the next 20 years, but really looking more towards the latter part of those 20 years than the former. You know, that is, it's not insignificant, but it is not on its own going to radically alter the strategic balance, especially not in the short term. And I think it's really important to situate AUKUS in wider regional trends and perspectives, the genuinely deteriorating strategic environment, China's coercive behaviour, the language that the Australian government's been using for some years now about this being like the new 1930s. We need to strengthen ourselves, but also the wider work on diplomatic arrangements, the Quad, other partnerships, they still matter.
Rory, if I could come back to the question of non-proliferation for a second. Now, clearly there is the humdrum around AUKUS is because it's the first time that a non-nuclear weapons state is going to be given essentially nuclear reactors, possibly fueled by highly enriched uranium. And it seems that what these 3 countries, Australia, the UK, and the US is doing is exercising a loophole. So the Comprehensive Safeguard Agreement of the IEA makes very clear that it is simply not practical to safeguard civil nuclear technologies or nuclear technologies more broadly in submarines. But doesn't this set a precedent, Rory? So I understand that it'll take 15 or 20 years, but down the line for a number of countries in Asia, for instance, doesn't this sort of set a new mainstream in non-proliferation?
Well, I think it's no secret that as the Australian government has really mobilised to make AUKUS a reality, there's a lot of mobilisation of bureaucratic and legal expertise across this town, across Canberra. And so I think in a way the non-proliferation expertise that Australia has in the past been quite famous for in building our own non-proliferation credentials in the international system, some of that is now going to be redeveloped or redirected to generate arrangements that will make AUKUS acceptable and sustainable under the global non-proliferation system. And you're absolutely right, this is at one level new territory. It is going to require, as I understand it, a special agreement or a special arrangement with the IAEA. I don't think that in the long run this is going to be some sort of existential problem for the non-proliferation regime. Adjustments can be made, in a strange kind of way. it makes us understand a little bit better how India may have felt back in 1998 when for India's very real strategic interests, you began working with partners like the United States and others to create, if you like, a kind of a special exception. Now, of course, we're not talking about nuclear weapons. Here in Australia's case, we are talking about nuclear propulsion. But I think that idea of creating new arrangements within or in parallel with the current international treaty regime is going to be what's required. I think that in time this will be achievable, in large part because of the good standing that Australia has painstakingly built up for itself over many years as a non-proliferation and arms control champion. I don't really buy the argument that the precedent that this would set of a country in good standing coming to its own arrangement for, if you like, nuclear fuel for these vessels being accepted as not being verifiable under safeguards is somehow going to open the way for Iran or whichever other country it may be that is not in good non-proliferation standing to suddenly accelerate its nuclear program. I don't see that happening, but I can see some really difficult legal arguments, and I do think it's reasonable that Australia goes the extra mile in providing those broader assurances. We do need to wind back, though, and think about what is the NPT for? What is the safeguards system for? I don't think it was designed to prevent nations from acquiring the non-nuclear weapons capabilities that they need to protect their interests in a much more coercive strategic environment.
Well, I can only guess that there are many in India who are trying to make the same arguments with regards to India. Obviously, it's a very different case study, but there are many who would like this kind of propulsion technology here. But Rory, if I could switch to a slightly politically sensitive question around the future of what is known as the trilateral between India, France, and Australia. Now, quite obviously, there's no other way of putting it. France and French officials from the top all the way down are livid about this agreement. The sensitivities cannot be overemphasized. You have been one of the key individuals. Your organization has been one of the key organizations to moot this trilateral with think tanks in different parts of the world. How do you see this trilateral evolving? Does it evolve at all in the future, or should we just say goodbye to the trilateral?
And so this is the Australia-India-France trilateral, which of course met at a ministerial level this year. There had even been talk of elevating it to a leaders level meeting, and our think tanks, including your institution, Rudra, have done some great work in setting the scene for that. So of course, at one level, it's deeply frustrating and disappointing that these promising relationships where we can work together across many issues, maritime security, resilience, the environment, and so forth, this relationship is apparently on hold. Look, it's understandable that French officials are so deeply disappointed, indeed angry, about AUKUS because, of course, it displaces the massive conventional submarine program that Australia and France had been developing together. And of course, there is also the accusation that AUKUS was developed, with extreme confidentiality, even secrecy. So, I accept all of that. But we have to, from an Australian perspective, we have to balance so many considerations now. Yes, we want cooperative relations with France in the Indo-Pacific. It's an Indo-Pacific power. It was before AUKUS, it was even before the 2016 submarine deal that some would argue France succeeded in gaining at the expense of Japan, but that's another story. And it will remain an Indo-Pacific partner. Just this week we're looking at the referendum in New Caledonia and wondering about how France is going to manage its Indo-Pacific equities there. So we need to find ways in time to rebuild and strengthen that relationship. It probably won't be what it was going to be 2 or 3 years ago without the anchor of the submarine program. But as I would argue, if France is serious about its strategic commitment to the Indo-Pacific, then in the long run, it can't have an Australia-shaped hole in that set of arrangements, even if Australia is no longer near the forefront of France's partnerships. The France-India relationship, very comprehensive, very strong. The Australia-India relationship has gone from strength to strength, especially in defence and security. So I would say we need to give this time. We need to look from an Australian perspective at other ways that we can work with and support France and the region, even if all of that may not be immediately welcomed. Part of the problem we have for the moment is with election campaigns, both in Australia and France as we speak. I mean, national elections in both countries in the first half of next year. It's going to be hard to get big gestures and big decisions out of governments on either side. So personally, I would look to India to show what leadership it can in helping us manage this family feud among democracies in the Indo-Pacific.
Rory, my last question is about the evolution of the Indo-Pacific. There's, of course, the Quad. And now from, following the in-person summit in September, there's a lot going on in the Quad in science and technology, in student movement, in fellowships. Then there is the AUKUS, which is something of a mini-lateral. And it's very clear from the readout that AUKUS is not just about nuclear technologies or propulsion technology. It's going to also be about science and tech cooperation. It's going to be about people-to-people movements and essentially creating something of a marketplace. So if you've got these two market spaces in the Indo-Pacific, 5 or 8 years down the line, does it make sense for these to simply merge?
So that's a good way of framing the question, I think, Rudra, because there has been a false assumption that somehow AUKUS will displace the Quad. It won't. And 2021, sure, it was the year of AUKUS, but it was also the year that the Quad went to summit level, leaders level, 2 substantial meetings, a comprehensive agenda that, as you say, is a lot more than ships in the water or perceived hawk talk about China. It's about vaccines, public goods, science and tech, climate, environment, and so forth, which is fantastic. And I think that the Quad and AUKUS and other arrangements can be complementary if we're smart about the diplomacy and that all of our countries actually invest in the diplomatic capability to coordinate, deconflict, complement one another. Look, I would say that AUKUS in the end for Australia is about building Australian strategic weight, building Australian capability. And so a stronger Australia is going to be good for the Quad. In theory, a stronger Australia is going to be good for those other arrangements, our engagement with ASEAN, our other mini-laterals and partnerships in the region. But there's a lot of delicacy and misperception to manage along the way. And we need to be active in looking for the opportunities. AUKUS, in my view, is in some ways a blank page. I mean, yes, there's the submarine program, which is very clearly trilateral, but as you say, there's also a critical technologies program under AUKUS, which in theory could come up with projects that bring in 4th or 5th or 6th countries. It could merge with some of the Quad work on tech. It could in time, I believe, even engage other Five Eyes or European partners or other partners one-on-one, such as India. So now's the time to be creative and not to stand still on these issues. I do think it's important for observers of this dialogue to understand that Australia has committed itself to AUKUS in a bipartisan way. Our bureaucracy is mobilised very rapidly on this, and I think that is a very serious road we've taken. We've crossed a kind of Rubicon here. So it's no longer about how do we unwind or move away from AUKUS, it's how do we make AUKUS work for those other relationships with the Quad and in time, indeed, with Europe. And don't forget that in the end, it's our shared concerns about China that has driven this sometimes untidy ferment of responses.
Thanks, Rory. And as you say, we can only hope that India can play that role of bridging power in this time of family feuds in the Indo-Pacific, and I'm sure it will. But Rory Medcalf, thank you so much for being with us at GTS 2021, and I hope to see you in person in Bengaluru next year this time. Thank you, Rory.
Thanks for the opportunity indeed, Rudra, and good luck with the conference.
James, if I could start with you. Soon after the AUKUS agreement was released, you wrote, and I quote, say, in my assessment, the non-proliferation implications of the AUKUS submarine deal are both negative and serious. Could I ask you to unpack that and possibly spend some time and take us through the complexity of this agreement?
Sure. Firstly, thank you very much for having me for this important event and important panel. I kind of feel like my job here is to be the party pooper. At a time when everybody's very excited about AUKUS and geopolitics and the competition against China, I think it's sometimes important to actually zoom in on the details, or in this case, the lack of any details. The governments involved fully acknowledge they haven't worked out these details. They're going to spend 18 months now trying to work them out. And if I have a central message, which I hope I do, it's that these details are going to be critical to the success of AUKUS, and the more you dig into the details, in my opinion, the less likely it is to succeed. We have two states, the US and the UK, with expertise in building nuclear reactors. They're going to have to combine their designs because neither of them wants to let the other one use its design by itself. That's going to be difficult. We have three states, Australia, the US, and the UK, who would all like a piece of the construction pie. When it comes to, Australia is a country that has one research reactor. It has very, very little background in nuclear technology. It's going to have to train a nuclear navy and the submariners from scratch. It's going to have to be supplied with the fuel. The fuel is going to, the highly radioactive spent fuel is going to have to be managed after it's removed from the reactors. This is like the opposite problem of construction. No one's going to want anything to do with the spent fuel, but somebody's going to have to take it. So even I think under the best case scenario, it's very hard to see Australia acquiring nuclear-propelled submarines by 2040 at the very earliest. And there's actually quite a high chance that this project will not result in Australia acquiring nuclear submarines at all. So if we take Rory's analogy literally, if we think this is 1930 today, this is as if the Allies in 1930 had decided to develop a technology to defeat Nazi Germany that wasn't going to be available till 1950 at the very earliest. And I think you can see why I have some skepticism about this. But let me dig down into the details of non-proliferation significantly. And you and Rory have already discussed the main contours of this argument. The basic idea behind the Non-Proliferation Treaty is that non-nuclear weapon states are allowed to do pretty much what they like in terms of nuclear technology, so long as they declare it and they allow it to be inspected. And that creates a particular problem for naval propulsion reactors, because practically you cannot inspect naval propulsion reactors. They're underwater. You don't know where they are. And so the safeguards agreement that non-nuclear weapon states are obliged to conclude with the NPT allows them to exempt nuclear material from safeguards. And you can talk about, second best arrangements. These are fundamentally all band-aids. These are sticking plasters. At the end of the day, Australia is going to exempt highly enriched uranium from safeguards. And no kind of periodic inspections are going to be adequate. The good news historically is this loophole has never been used. Countries including Iran and Canada and Brazil have threatened to use it and have made moves in that direction, but they've never actually exempted nuclear material from safeguards. And my big concern here is that when Australia does that, it will set a precedent that other, much less trustworthy countries with bad non-proliferation records, unlike Australia, but that other countries are going to use. I believe prior to AUKUS, if Iran had announced, as it's threatened to do, that it would remove nuclear material from safeguards, I think there would have been a huge backlash. I think even Russia and China would have put tremendous pressure on Iran not to follow through on that. The AUKUS announcement means that if Iran were to follow that, I think the pressure today would be less than it would have been otherwise. And if Australia actually goes ahead and removes nuclear material from safeguards, I think Iran will face a very, very mild backlash. And effectively what that does is it weakens deterrence. It gives Iran and other less trustworthy states a reason to invoke should they want to remove nuclear material from safeguards for the purpose of a nuclear weapons program in the future. And Rory is 100% correct when he says that Australia has a great non-proliferation record. And objectively, like I, as an American, who you could probably tell from the accent, was born in the UK, like I'm not worried about Australia removing nuclear material from safeguards. But the reality is that many states are not prepared to say, well, Australia has a better record, so it should be allowed to do it, but Iran shouldn't. This kind of discriminatory system in which some countries are allowed to exercise a loophole and some countries aren't, I think is inherently going to be an unsustainable one. And that's why I think the non-proliferation costs or the proliferation costs associated with AUKUS are likely to be significant.
James, thanks. I'm going to come back on some of those points, and I'm going to come back. You also laid down a set of criteria, about 9 or 10 different suggestions that you have, that if this agreement were to go ahead, you could safeguard non-proliferation regime by adhering to these. I'm going to come back on those points in a few minutes. Manpreet, question for you. Soon after AUKUS, you also wrote, and in a sense, it was a bit of the safe bet. I mean, the piece that you wrote seems to suggest that, look, it's both a positive and a negative for India. It's a positive because at some point it strengthens deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. It strengthens the idea of collective security. It provides a good degree of hard power inside of the Indo-Pacific. But as James says, that kind of hard power we can only expect in about 20 years from now, 2040, 2045 maybe. And on the negative, you make the same argument that James does, that it sets a bad precedent. In fact, you go as far as to say is that, look, if this agreement takes place, perhaps China may want to explore a loophole with Pakistan. Although obviously Pakistan's nuclear credentials are very different to Australia's. Where do you see things now, both from your own perspective as someone who works on non-proliferation, but also from a perspective from Delhi? How is the AUKUS sort of agreement being read here in Delhi?
Thanks, Rudra. First of all, I do want to thank you for inviting me to be part of this summit, and especially this panel where I have the opportunity of sharing thoughts with three top-class scholars on a subject which is just about 3 months old, and it has already evoked much interest and comment from different quarters. So you have pretty much encapsulated, my thought process in the article that I was trying to give out. And even after a month and a half of having written that piece, I don't think the Indian position seems to have changed too much. From what is known from the official point of view, well, India has taken a hands-off approach, believing that this is something between the allies and that they have to sort of take care of it. I don't see any reason why India needs to be miffed, because there were some people who said that, it's left India in the lurch. I don't think we have any reason to feel a sense of betrayal by what has happened, because this was really between the allies. And as I have argued, India has two prisms through which one can look at this arrangement. The first one is national security. And if the primary driver for AUKUS is really China, a country which has displayed expansionist tendencies and aggressive positions across the region, and India has been at the receiving end of this for quite some time now, especially since 2020, then with this threat looming large, I think anything that distracts China and complicates its security actually eases pressure on India, and therefore it is a welcome move. The transfer of nuclear-powered submarines will take place to a Quad member, and India does look at Quad as an important security initiative. So unlike those who've argued that AUKUS would weaken the focus on Quad, I don't think so. Rather, the availability of SSNs, as and when they come, and I am completely with James and Rory that it's not going to happen in the short term. But as and when the SSNs become available, their advantage of greater stealth, endurance, carrying capacity, all of that will come to a partner of India in Quad, and therefore it will strengthen the overall power projection in Indo-Pacific. So from India's perspective, looking at the way in which China is very aggrieved by this arrangement, I don't think it's a bad deal, and it actually enhances deterrence. But the benefits of AUKUS begin to lose, I think, some of their sheen when you see them from the lens of non-proliferation. And I am with James completely on how he's put across what are going to be the loopholes of the NPT, which will sort of become more pronounced with AUKUS. And for me, largely, as a non-NPT state from India, the precedent that this transfer of technology is going to set with the transfer of nuclear material as well as technology for nuclear-powered submarines to another country is what really is the problem area. Such transfers have traditionally been avoided for the potential proliferation risks. Remember, even Russia had leased a nuclear power submarine to India without any transfer of technology. Now, the US claims that this is a one-off special arrangement for an ally against a common adversary. But the problem with this logic is that the adversary, which is being deterred, may also want to make a similar exception for its own allies. So AUKUS could then open the door for China-Pak nuclear collaboration more than what we have seen in the past. China, wants to make exceptions for its iron brother, Pakistan. And Pakistan, obviously, its Naval Strategic Forces Command is very, very interested in having credible platforms. So availability of SSNs would help Pakistan then to learn the nuances of naval propulsion besides training for operations on such platforms. And that is going to cause concern for India. Since China is openly seeking parity with the US in being a global rule maker, this will be an opportunity for it then to prove its credentials as that, in that position. And North Korea and Iran could also be potential Chinese customers. So coming back to the point that James was, emphasizing, Australia is not a proliferation concern, but the countries that become China's customers on this would be, because they don't have either IAEA full scope safeguards, and neither of them has a good compliance record either. So if China was to offer this to these countries, that is where I think the problem lies. Another problematic issue would be proliferation of these platforms in general. Countries like Argentina, Brazil, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Saudi Arabia, Iran have all expressed interest in having SSNs. And AUKUS could then open the door for many such acquisitions to take place. So would more be better? Well, SSNs are useful military platforms, certainly not prohibited by any legal instrument, not by the NPT. So the challenge then will be, how are we going to ensure safeguards over nuclear material in such platforms? As James has pointed out, these, basing of these SSNs is not going to be accessible to the IAEA. So how do they actually do that in terms of safeguards? Currently, only 6 countries, all with nuclear weapons, are operating SSNs. So the issue of exemption or safeguard, has not really been pertinent. But if SSN proliferation becomes a reality, then safeguards on nuclear material in naval reactors will have to be carefully addressed. So basically, the point I'm trying to get at is that AUKUS has been crafted to address a looming concern, which is equally for India, which is China. The AUKUS plans to do this by strengthening the deterrent capability of a US ally, with which India does not have a problem. But the deal might end up opening the possibility of new security dilemmas, which could well happen in our region. And that could happen in the short term, even before the AUKUS has really given us the fruits that it is looking for. And that really is going to be a matter of concern for India. So this is where I see the problem with AUKUS.
Thanks, Manpreet. I'm going to come back to this point about non-proliferation. And if I go back to Rory's message, I wonder if we're over-exaggerating the non-proliferation concerns or the concerns around precedent. So I'll come back to you and James on this. But if I could switch to Bruno. Bruno, I presume you're in Paris, or at least you're in France at this particular point in time. French officials from the top down have been livid, disappointed, angry in public about this particular agreement. You've taken an interesting position. I was reading the piece that you did on AUKUS, the co-authored piece, where you've taken a slightly more sober position, where you encourage a degree of rethink within France of its own Indo-Pacific strategy. So I was wondering if you could give us a sense of, is Paris still as livid with AUKUS as it was on the 15th of September and a little bit after? That's first. And second is, what does this rethink of France's Indo-Pacific strategy actually mean?
Yeah, thank you, Rudra. Believe me, they were livid in private as much as they were in public. And I cannot emphasize enough the sense of betrayal that was felt in Paris, not only in the government, but also the broader public opinion. I, for one, never thought I would participate in a televised debate entitled, "Should France leave the Atlantic Alliance altogether?" Now, reality check, we are still interested in the Indo-Pacific. We are still, as you know, very much a presence, we're physically present in the Indo-Pacific, notably through our overseas territory. I believe that the referendum in New Caledonia on 12th of December will actually confirm that New Caledonia will remain French, albeit perhaps with a new autonomy status. So yes, we've after the disappointment and the sense of betrayal, we rolled up our sleeves and tried to reassess our whole strategy in the region. We will remain, as my friend Rory Medcalf said, we will remain a partner of Australia because we are a neighbor of Australia. So we'll have to work with them, albeit in different ways. But I assume that, as I recommended with a colleague in the piece you just mentioned, that we'll perhaps deepen more or even more our connections and links and the cooperations with India and as well as with Japan, which are the other two great partners of ours in the region, aside, of course, from the United States, who was never an adversary in this whole game, because our whole cooperation with Australia was also based on the assumption that we would work alongside the United States and not against the United States. But tackling maybe the non-proliferation dimension that you wanted us to talk about, I actually have a slightly different view than my friend and colleague James, and I feel slightly actually closer to the previous speakers. I don't think the nuclear proliferation problem is that big a deal. Granted, I mean, I hear the arguments of those who say that the US has broken a taboo, in a sense, a taboo that, I can't imagine what the US reaction would have been, by the way, if it had been France being the first country to sell nuclear-powered submarine to a country like Australia. Of course, we at some point came close to selling such subs to, there was in Canada in the late 80s, but never came to fruition. But let me give you an unconventional view. Maybe it's actually good for non-proliferation. Let me explain. If these submarines are indeed being delivered, and that's a huge if, because I actually think that there's a good chance that Australia will never get any nuclear-powered submarines of its own, because in addition to the constraints that have been mentioned by James, there's also the fact that simply the US and the UK building capabilities are just not there for the next 20 years at least, and that Australia building its own capability to man and operate submarine is something that will take several decades. So, I mean, I like James' comparison with the 1930s, but I think it's even worse than that. And if I had to bet, I would say that Australia will get some Australian officers on US and UK submarines operating in the region, but that will be pretty much it. But why do I think there might be a silver lining in terms of non-proliferation? Because if Australia was to get these submarines, and even if it did not get those, even if AUKUS ended up being a partnership without the submarines, which may be actually the most important part of AUKUS, not the submarine, but all the rest, then the reassurance that the US and to some extent the UK will provide to Canberra will put an end about these to these debates that you have sometimes in the Australian think tank and media commentariat about the possibility that one day Australia may have to go nuclear to safeguard its vital interests. So maybe in that sense, the reassurance provided by AUKUS may even have some non-proliferation benefits.
Thanks, Bruno. I'm going to switch to James. James, I think Bruno offers a somewhat complicated and circular logic to non-proliferation. I'm still trying to work out the math in my mind. But I was just wondering if you wanted to react to Bruno, but also I wanted to push you on the question of non-proliferation. Are we over-exaggerating the non-proliferation concerns from this particular agreement? I mean, as Manpreet said, is it really feasible that countries like Iran or Pakistan, with their non-proliferation records, could even consider getting something like this through a process in Vienna, for instance? Second, you've laid out a range of criterias that you think should be adhered to if the AUKUS agreement goes through, and which in a sense could mitigate against weakening the non-proliferation regime. So I was wondering, one, if you could react to Bruno's proposition, and number two, if you could just walk us through how you think the proliferation regime could be strengthened if this loophole were to become something more mainstream.
Sure. I mean, a couple of thoughts. Firstly, I think there are, linking directly back to what Bruno said, I think there are ways other than nuclear submarines by which the UK and the US and France as well could demonstrate their commitment to defend their allies and hence reduce proliferation pressures. I don't think AUKUS is unique in its ability to do that. But let me zoom out to the non-pro big picture here. Let me ask two questions. Would we be concerned if other non-nuclear weapon states follow Australia's lead and potentially exempt nuclear material from safeguards? And does Australia exempting nuclear material from safeguards make it more likely that other states will do so? And I say the answer to both questions is clearly yes. If Iran goes ahead and announces that it's removing nuclear material from safeguards, the US is going to go, I can only think of an expletive I'm not going to say at a panel. US would go crazy if Iran did that. And I think more than that, Australia setting a precedent makes it more likely that other countries will follow. It seems very unlikely to me that Australia could go ahead and exempt nuclear material from safeguards, and other countries are going to go, well, we have worse non-proliferation records, so we're not going to follow the Australian lead. I mean, this is an excuse that countries like Iran are just waiting for. I mean, I have no doubt that the Iranian regime had a big party the day that AUKUS was announced. This is great for them. I think actually Pakistan is in a slightly different category because Pakistan is not a non-nuclear weapon state. I think that the precedent that Pakistan would cite if it receives naval propulsion technology from China is Russia's provision of submarines to India. I mean, I would place the states outside the NPT in a different basket here. And finally, in terms of criteria, look, this is something of a band-aid. I do think it makes the problem less bad. But what I've argued is that the UK and the US and Australia should jointly articulate a set of objective criteria by which they believe that Australia qualifies to use this exemption. They could cite things like Australia has a comprehensive safeguards agreement in force. It has an additional protocol in force. It's not been found in non-compliance in Australia's case, forever. There's never been a report from the IEA Director General to the board about concerns in Australia. It signed and ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Now, look, I want to be very clear about my proposal for criteria. It would not solve the non-proliferation problem. right? Iran is still going to cite AUKUS as a precedent when it removes nuclear material from safeguards for naval propulsion. But I do think these objective non-proliferation criteria provide a seemingly less opportunistic ground for opposing Iran and other states that may do so in the future.
Yeah, thanks, James. Manpreet, just a question for you is, in Bruno's piece, he's got 4 issues, and really, Bruno, you should be talking about this, but you've got 4 rethinks for France. A lot of it is about the Quad, strengthening relations with Japan, with India, with Asia. But there's one key point that Bruno makes is perhaps this opens up an opportunity for France and India to consider selling similar technology, low-enriched uranium, from France to India. Do you think that's something that is being seriously considered here? I mean, James made the point about a precedent with actors with a very poor non-proliferation record who are just waiting for this moment to happen. And I was just wondering, from an Indian perspective, the math adds up. It seems to make sense that if this precedent took place down the line, Indian negotiators would say, hey, France is willing to sell this to us, and we've gone through this entire very complicated process with the IAEA between 2005, 2008, when we signed the US-India nuclear agreement. We're a good non-proliferation actor that has nuclear weapons. Why not?
So yes, Rudra, I'm sure this thought has crossed the minds of many Indians, and it has also been vocalized, I think, in several newspaper articles to say that this opens up an opportunity for India to get, the SSN technology from France. As you know, India has been working on its own technology and, with some external help on this for quite some time now. SSNs, as I said earlier, are very useful military platforms to have. Of course, where the math will have to be done correctly is, what does this mean in terms of raising more proliferation risks, more security dilemmas, because others are also going to follow suit. And therefore, is it going to be worth taking that chance? But as I said, it's an opportunity which has been opened up, and there's no reason why India will not be considering it. But on your earlier question also, Rudra, which you had asked about, are we exaggerating the threat? So the concern from AUKUS is not about proliferation threat from Australia. I think on that, all of us are very clear. Australia's clean record on non-proliferation, the fact that it will arrive at some kind of an arrangement with the IAEA on the naval propulsion that it gets, the material, and that it will live by those commitments. The problem now, James has mentioned Iran several times, and sitting in the US, I can imagine his threat perception is coming from Iran. And certainly there is a distinction between Iran and Pakistan in terms of their NPT status. But from my threat perception, where I am sitting in India, the most automatic threat that comes to my mind is what China will do with Pakistan, because China has been a proliferator in the past. The relationship between China and Pakistan on nuclear and missile nexus is very well known by now. So why would China, let go of this opportunity? And even before anything becomes available to Australia, such SSNs, and I would even go to the extent of thinking about SSBNs, that technology could also be made available to Pakistan. And this is not a small concern, I think, for India. James says that they would take the precedent from Russia-India relationship on this. But in the case of Russia-India, the biggest difference was there was no transfer of technology. It was just a platform that was leased and returned without unpacking it in any form. But what could happen after AUKUS is transfer of technology on this. And that, I think, remains a concern. And very lastly, since I have the floor, I was very amused by what Rory said about, they're now sharing the perspective about how India might have felt when the Indo-US nuclear deal was being negotiated. So Australia was a big critic and opponent of the Indo-US nuclear deal at that time. They came around to accepting India in the non-proliferation, tent after a very long time. But I think what is becoming clear is that the NPT is not cast in stone, that there will be exceptions that are made to accommodate the new geopolitical environment, because the NPT was made in a different time and for different threat perceptions. So while some of the proliferation threats have remained, the geopolitics has changed so drastically that there will be these, tweaks that happen to the NPT every now and then.
No, thanks, Manpreet. When Rory said that, it kind of tickled. I think it'll tickle many of us who followed that agreement very carefully and looked at each of those countries that was either for or against. I'm just going to take a last round of questions, and if you have any concluding thoughts, please add them. Starting with Bruno. Bruno, I have two questions. One is more transactional. It's the same as Manpreet. Do you think there's a thinking in France now that to do more with India, perhaps we could make sort of low-enriched uranium technology, propulsion technology available to India? And a broader geostrategic question is, there's a lot of argument in India, at least, about AUKUS on the one side and the Quad as the other. Both seem to be a marketplace. What's interesting about AUKUS is that the submarine deal is the first big kind of agreement, the headline. But underneath that, there's quite a bit on cooperation in emerging technologies, sensitive technologies. So I was just wondering is, geopolitically, where does this leave us in the Indo-Pacific?
Three quick points, Bruno. First of all, it's difficult for me not to mention here what our good friend and mutual friend and colleague George Perkovich said when he reminded us that more than 15 years after the 2005 US-India nuclear deal, there's not a single nuclear reactor of US origin being constructed in India. And I suspect that it will be even worse for the AUKUS submarine deal, as I suspected. To answer your question, I don't think that the French will make spontaneous proposals, but certainly they will feel very comfortable answering to a possible request for a study by India of possible transfer of nuclear submarine technology, or even sales or joint construction, on the grounds that one, as you just reminded us, and Manpreet reminded us, these are, on three grounds. First, the taboo has been broken by the United States. Two, we only make LEU and not HEU powered submarine. And three, India is a nuclear power state. And so for all these reasons, and also a trusted ally, of course. So for all these reasons, we would be extremely comfortable in considering such idea or proposal, or at least we would not feel restrained by the previous taboo that or tradition of non-sale, call it whatever you want, that our American friends with their UK and Australian colleagues have just exploded. On the Quad, very briefly, I think AUKUS and the Quad are very different. I think the potential for deep technological cooperation within the AUKUS is actually much more important and deeper than within the Quad. I think the Quad is a different animal, but my personal suggestion that I've made for several weeks now for a graceful exit of this whole AUKUS would be to have, in addition to the Quad, a separate format, which you could call enlarged Quad or whatever you want, in which both the UK and France would participate in such enlarged Quad meetings, not to replace the Quad, but in addition to the Quad. And that would be a sort of graceful exit to this whole affair, and not to assuage French sensitivities, but just to move forward and find the best ways all together, the US, the UK, Australia, India, Japan, and France to work together to address the challenges of the Indo-Pacific.
Thanks, Bruno. If I had to be an over-optimist, I'd say perhaps that's why France did not expel its ambassador to the UK, but it did so to Australia and to the United States. James,
it was about punishing one, ignoring the other, etc., etc. So
James, if I could ask you, are we in an era where we are moving from unconditional non-proliferation to conditional non-proliferation? Is this the kind of trend now? I mean, one could argue the trend started a long time ago, but are we in that space? And the second question, which may not make sense, but with the AUKUS agreement, does it complicate a potential negotiation between the United States, Europe, and Iran on the nuclear deal?
The first question was you asked are we in a moving from an era of unconditional proliferation to conditional proliferation? the US the US has never maintained an entirely unconditional non-proliferation policy. I think back to a decision that I was very critical of, for example, when South Korea in the early 2000s was found to have conducted really quite serious undeclared enrichment experiments. And the United States protected it from being referred to the Board of Governors. There's always been these examples, and I believe that they have contributed to a general degradation of the non-proliferation regime. And looking forward, I don't necessarily think we're going to have a sudden falling apart of the NPT, but I do think these pressures that stem, at least in part, from a discriminatory approach to trying to enforce the NPT are likely to lead to its degradation. Now, look, I think safeguards non-compliance by Iran, for example, is a more serious problem there. I'm not for one second claiming that a discriminatory approach to implementation is the only reason, but I do think it's a real factor. And then, sorry, can you remind me of your second question?
Well, I mean, it was most of a sort of stargazing question, which is to say is there any merit to the argument that AUKUS could complicate a potential negotiation with Iran?
So I actually don't think so in the short term, because I think the sensible play for the Iranians is to hold the possibility of removing nuclear material from safeguards in their pocket and not to put it on the table during negotiations. Like, I'm very skeptical we're going to be able to put the JCPOA back together. I think the decision to withdraw from the JCPOA will be viewed in future as one of the great geopolitical blunders of the decade. But I actually think the sensible play for the Iranians here is not to try and put this on the table right now. I think it's to hold it in their back pocket and then use it at some time in the future as and when they want to.
Thanks, James. And if I could end with Manpreet with any lasting thoughts, but the specific one I wanted to ask you is, if hypothetically nations listen to James all the time, but say hypothetically now, they look at James's 9 criteria for strengthening the non-proliferation regime. Some of it includes signing the CTBT, for instance. So the playoff over here seems to be is, if AUKUS is going to go ahead, it may take 20 years, 25 years, but if it is to go ahead, the best way to do it is to protect the regime, is to kind of sign up to these 7, 8, 9 criteria. And I'm sure George, who Bruno mentioned, and many others will have sort of their own bucket list. How is India going to deal with that world? I mean, it's a hypothetical question. We have our own history with non-proliferation. CTBT is something that I haven't heard for in a very long time. So if that's the direction that the universe takes when it comes to non-proliferation, where does this leave India?
Similar criteria-based approaches had emerged when the Indo-US nuclear deal was going on, and there was a list which was drawn up even at that moment in time to say countries must sign up to this to be able to get a similar agreement in the future. I expect this to be of the similar nature, where the criteria is coming up now for the other countries that might be interested in SSNs. But unless it happens at the NPT review conference at some level, individual criteria being floated by different countries is not going to be acceptable. People will accept what is in their national interest and ignore the rest of it. But just to end on this thought about, India's security challenges are many. So irrespective of what AUKUS does in the long term, short term, irrespective of how Quad shapes up, I think we have to stand up for our own security concerns. So while these little pieces are helpful to some extent, in the long run, India's own capability will have to be built up for its own security. So that's how I think India is looking at all of these developments and picking all the good things that might come out of it, but nobody's holding their breath on something really materializing.
And maybe on the capabilities question, as Bruno also writes, strike when the iron is hot, sign an agreement with France, shore up your nuclear capabilities, your sort of submarine capabilities in the East Indian Ocean. And I can only hope that that's the way parts of the government is thinking, opening up a number of other, obviously, agreements and disagreements. But James Acton, Bruno Tertrais, Manpreet Sethi, thank you so much for being with us at the Global Technology Summit 2021. And we look forward to having you in Bengaluru next year in presence. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.